Whisky is poised to bring some cheer to the economy of the Solway coast town of Annan. A roadside sign indicates the restoration of a long-closed former distillery at a farm on the northern edge of the Royal Borough and close to the River Annan. Dumfries-born academic and businessman Professor David Thomson and his wife Teresa Church are partners in the £4.5 million project.
When do you expect whisky to be coming out of the distillery?
Well, we're hoping that we'll be making spirit towards the end of 2012, maybe early 2013, but fingers crossed for 2012. And it will be saleable as whisky 3 years after that, so around about the very end of 2015 or early 2016 for some young Annandale whisky.
And what will the brand be called?
It will be called Annandale Lowland Single Malt Scotch Whisky.
And how unique is this distillery?
Oh, it's very unique because there are none others working in this part of Scotland. There are no distilleries in the borders. There's one in Dumfries and Galloway at Bladnoch, and that's it. And then the next distillery is up towards Edinburgh, and another one in Glasgow, and that's about it really, so it's pretty unique.
Would you describe this as a labour of love? Obviously it's quite a big commitment and a big investment.
It sure is, yeah. I would describe it as a labour of love, yes. I don't think, unless you're heavily committed to doing something like this, you'd want to take it on, and you'd have to feel quite passionate about it. But we want to make it economically successful as well, so that it can stand on its own 2 feet eventually.
How many people will be employed here?
It takes remarkably few people actually to run a distillery. So within the distillery itself there'll probably be 3 people per shift. So maybe there'll be 6 people in total working the distillery, but of course it's all the other things like the shop and the cafe and the visitor centre and tour guides and so forth. So there might be quite a lot of people employed, particularly in the tourist season. It might be as many as 20, I don't know, I'll have to see.
And could you point to these buildings and tell us exactly what they are?
Yes. I'll start with this building over here. This is the bonded warehouse that was built in the Johnny Walker era, so around about 1895 to 1900. There's 2 of them, and they're being completely restored inside and out, new roofs built in them. This building here is the maltings, and that's where the malted barley would be, the barley would be germinated and turned into malted barley on the ground floor and the floor above it. And that's a very important part of the whisky making process. We will eventually malt barley here again at Annandale Distillery, but not at first because it's a very complicated process. So we've got to get going first. Let's make some whisky first with bought-in malted barley, and then we'll start thinking about malting it ourselves.
This tower is quite a landmark, isn't it?
That's a very important landmark. It's a malt kiln. I mentioned a moment ago that we germinate the barley in order to malt it, and that means it gets damp. It has to be made damp in order for that to happen. And to stop the germination process, we have to dry it, and to do that, it's put in a kiln, and that's what that is. It's a malt kiln. And what's really important about it is the shape of it, because it's got that characteristic ventilator on the top, and it's actually designed by the very famous whisky architect or distillery architect called Charles Doig, who worked out of Elgin around 1890-1900. And the other thing that really matters about this, Brian, is that in order to dry the malted barley, of course you need to have a source of heat, and it would have been peat. And it had been peat, we think probably from Craigh Moss, actually. And of course that tells us also that the whisky would probably have been smoky and peaty in character, unlike what people think lowland whisky is just now. But of course that's just a modern interpretation of lowland whisky. Most of it would have been peaty and smoky, and certainly one of the expressions of Annandale will be peaty and smoky, and the fact that that's my favourite is not a coincidence.
And will there be peat used in the process in the future?
Eventually, yes. We hope to fire up the kiln one day. That'll be sometime further down the line, but yes, we hope to fire up the kiln with, if we can source it, local peat, and we'd like to actually source local barley and do the whole process. I'd like to make a truly Annandale whisky.
Streams which once drove a grain mill wheel pass through the heart of the Annandale distillery. The buildings had been used for agriculture since whisky production ceased in 1924. The massive restoration and civil engineering project should be completed over the coming year. With trial runs planned for late 2012, the first bottles of mature malt whisky should be available 3 years later. An international brand of whisky and the tourism it generates will add to the existing mix of industries, which will hopefully keep income flowing into Annan's economy through the difficult times ahead.